Good evening to everyone in India and Asia. Good morning or afternoon to those joining us from other parts of the world. My name is Constantino Xavier. I'm a fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP, in New Delhi, together with Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, who's our distinguished fellow at CSEP. It's our great pleasure to host you all today for this book seminar on Professor Kanti Bajpai's new book, India versus China, Why They Are Not Friends. This is published by Juggernaut in India. Special thanks to Chiki Sarkar, who kindly gave us first dibs on having proper panel, public panel discussions or a discussion on this fine book. I'll promise I won't take too much of your time, but I just wanted to quickly introduce our really wonderful set of speakers and welcome them from different parts of the world. First of all, guilty for bringing us here, Professor Kanti Bajpai with this fine book. He's the director at the Center on Asia and Globalization and the Wilmer Professor of Asian Studies at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Prior to this, Professor Bajpai was also teaching at Oxford University and Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Welcome, Kanti, you're joining us from Singapore.
Thank you, yes.
Dr. Tanvi Madan, she's a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program and director of the India Project at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Tanvi is also the author of a wonderful recent book that I think will help us to understand this India-China relationship today, The Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped US-India Relations During the Cold War. Tanvi, I actually have 2 copies of your book, but none here with me, otherwise I would show it off. But welcome, Tanvi, from D.C. Tanvi, I think you're muted.
I wasn't saying anything. Thank you, Tino.
Welcome. Good to see you. Professor Jabin Jacob, he's an associate professor at the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at Shiv Nadar University and adjunct research fellow also at the National Maritime Foundation in New Delhi. Jabin, I believe you're joining us from Delhi or Noida. Welcome.
Thank you, Tino. Pleasure to be here. I look forward to the discussions.
Great. And our in-house China expert with Ambassador Menon, Antara Ghoshal Singh. She's a research associate at CSEP. She's a graduate from Tsinghua University in Beijing, the School of Public Policy and Management. She was also a Chinese language fellow at the National Central University of Taiwan. Welcome, Antara.
Thank you, Tino. Pleasure to be here.
Great. And let me introduce our chair. Delighted that Ambassador Menon honored us with kicking off this discussion and leading it here today. Ambassador Menon is a distinguished fellow at CSEP, as I mentioned before. He served as the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India between 2010 and 14, also as Foreign Secretary of India. In his career in India's Foreign Service, he headed India's missions to China, Pakistan, Israel, and Sri Lanka. And we just recently launched his fine book that I suspect will also help us to understand the India-China relationship today, India and Asian geopolitics, the past, present. Ambassador Menon, thank you so much for leading this discussion today. Over to you.
Thank you, Tino. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to this discussion and to chairing it because I hope to learn a lot. I must begin by thanking Kanti for giving us a wonderful reason to meet and discuss India-China relations. I mean, this is an amazing book. From my point of view, it's very rare that you get a book which makes sense, is coherent, is academically rigorous, and yet is also readable and accessible. And that is really quite an achievement. I can't think of very many books like this. So what I thought we'd try and do is to first ask Kanti to tell us why he wrote the book, tell the audience a little bit about the book, and then I'd turn to the 3 discussants to tell us what they think. I have a few questions of my own, which I'd like to ask since I enjoyed the book so much, and then open it up to the audience. So over to you, Kanti, to tell us about the book and why you wrote it.
Shankar, thanks very much. Thanks also to CSEP and its management and leadership Nice to see old friends here and several people on the panel, of course, as well. Very kind of Tanvi to wake up early in the morning in Washington, D.C. to join us. On the book, let me just begin by saying why I wrote it. I mean, I think, to be very honest, Juggernaut books were a juggernaut, and they kind of pushed me into doing it. I think Chicky realized that, or felt that there was room for a book that appealed to a general audience, but combined, as Shankar said very kindly, an element of academic kind of rigor. And all I mean by rigor is no great theory or anything like that, but just to work through things fairly systematically and as clearly as possible and lay out some assumptions and so forth. So I think that was the objective. At a time, obviously, Juggernaut got hold of me about a year ago almost now, right in the midst of course, the 2020 crisis in Eastern Ladakh. And so I think it came from that, a general feeling that an accessible and relatively short book was needed, and events seemed to precipitate the urgency of doing it. So this book was written actually in 3 months and finished in November of last year, and then production delayed it somewhat, but that's the normal. The book really has 4 major parts, which I organized in 4 Ps: perceptions, perimeters, partnerships, and power. And so I'll just say a couple of words about each of those Ps to give you a sense of what the book does. The first P, and I put it right at the front of the book because I thought it was so important, is the issue of mutual perceptions between India and China. And the broad thesis in that chapter is that starting from a position of mutual respect, and particularly Chinese respect for India via the Buddhist relationship, it moved gradually to a position of growing disdain, particularly on the Chinese side, by about the 19th century. And on the Indian side as well, of course, there's been a certain amount of racism and disdain as well. And so that's the broad thesis there. I mean, it's a huge, big wash, as it were, over culture and history from the arrival of sort of Buddhism in China right through to the present time. So at the end of the chapter, I also show some data. By the way, this is a completely synthetic book. So it just draws on a very good work that's already out there. I make no pretense at gathering new data or new research. But it ends up, this chapter, by showing that, right up to the present, I mean, the sense of disdain on both sides, or cultural discomfort, or looking down one's noses at each other, I mean, that's continued, and it's probably particularly marked on the Chinese side, I think, at the elite level, most of all. The second P is perimeters. So this is really, of course, the border issue. So there's no getting away from that as being a major reason why the two countries are in kind of cycles of conflict. But it also includes Tibet, because it's very hard to talk about, it seemed to me, the border issue without discussing Tibet. And that's very true on the Chinese side. It's also true, I think, on the Indian side as a result. And so what I thought was interesting as I looked at the perimeter issue from 1949 to the present is that you can see kind of 2 cycles of that move from some attempt at cooperation in the 40s and 50s, particularly, border discussions intermittently carried out in various ways, to, of course, then, peaking in the war of 1962, you come to conflict. And likewise, thereafter, pretty much almost, very soon after the war ended, attempts to reach out from Delhi to Beijing, particularly, to start another process of cooperation that really, in a sense, extends all the way up to, let's say, peaking in the Ladakh conflict of last year. So you get 2 very long cycles from cooperation to conflict. And in that, of course, the status of Tibet is a very big story, I think, very much so until the 1962 war, but not absent thereafter. And we'll probably talk about that a bit more and I think there's already a question on the Dalai Lama in Tibet in the chat function. And the third P is partnership. So it did seem to me that, which is, I think, fairly natural, that you would have to set India-China relations in a larger context of world politics. And so the partnerships chapter is about how India and China really have never been on the same side strategically. They've never been strategic partners. But here too, I saw two cycles of movement from a kind of, one might say, a convergence, a certain degree of strategic convergence, which was almost like a diplomatic entente, to rivalry, and then to a Cold War rivalry. And so this happens from 49 to the end of the Cold War. And from the end of the Cold War, you get again a second cycle of an entente, with the Americans being rampant in the world, China and India somewhat uneasy with the dominance of the Americans. And then it moves gradually, particularly by about, well, after the nuclear tests of 1998, 99, and then into the nuclear talks between India and the US, you get, a distancing of India and China again as India gets closer to the United States. And it's, I would say today that, we're back into a kind of almost Cold War rivalry as the United States-China rivalry really becomes more severe. And with the Ladakh problem, India has shifted, much closer to the United States, perhaps closer than ever before since 1949. And so I think there's an implication of the fact that they've never been on the same side, which is that, there isn't a kind of social capital or diplomatic capital to draw on where they were on the same side and they consulted and worked with each other at the highest levels in the civilian authority, in military authorities, amongst the highest level politicians. They don't have that to draw on, it seems to me, to get over periods of conflict and disagreement. And the last P, and then I'll just stop there, is of course an estimation of the power balance between them. And by that I mean comprehensive national power, military power, economic power, and soft power. And there what we see is a much more linear story of India and China being more or less on equal terms up to about, I would say, even the late 60s, early 70s, or even some people say the early 80s. And then you get a real opening up of the gap, particularly economically. And I think we're all familiar with the fact that China's GDP today is probably about 5 times India's size. Per capita income is about 4 times India's. And what's worrying, I think, there is that while there have been periods where India has outpaced growth, very few years in the 60, 70 years since China began to give us those figures, the fact is that building on a much bigger base, if Chinese and Indian growth rates are about the same, then the gap is actually is going to grow. But one of the interesting points in that chapter is that notwithstanding Chinese military superiority in various weapon systems, in fact, India, if it plays its military cards right, can hold the Chinese, and partly geography, and partly if you're nimble-footed in your strategy, I think India is still in a position, both in the maritime domain, but particularly also in the mountains, to hold the Chinese. One aspect of this chapter that has drawn quite a lot of attention has been my contention that China outpaces India in soft power, which I think a lot of people have felt that India had the soft power game over the Chinese. But looking at some data from the Lowy Institute in Australia and just kind of my own travels to China or talking to people in other regions of other societies, you get a sense really that even on the soft power, notwithstanding India's democracy and kind of open society, it's really China that scores even there by some factors. I mean, it's very hard to estimate these things, but I think the book argues that case, and I'm prepared to be shown that that's wrong, but I think that chapter does show that if you add up the three, it doesn't look good for India. The gap is very big and probably growing. And so, these are 4 reasons why India and China really aren't friends. And you could say, as social scientists say, oh, that's overdetermination. Any one of these might explain why they're not friends. When you have all 4 of them, I mean, it seems to me that quite difficult to bridge the gap between the 2 countries in terms of diplomacy and in terms of their feelings about each other. So let me just stop there.
Thank you, Kanti. Thank you very much for that. I think you're being very modest when you say it's a synthetic book, because if nothing else, you've given us a conceptual frame to actually think about India-China relations in the past, the present. And I was going to ask you later, what of the future? I mean, because it does sound quite pessimistic. It's one thing to say why they are not friends, but will they never be friends? Because these are pretty structural, all 4 Ps. And it's difficult to see them changing, at least in the foreseeable future. But I'll maybe bother you with that after we've heard what the others have to say. I'll turn now to Tanvi Madan. Tanvi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon, and also thank you to Rakesh Mohan, Vikram Mehta, Tino Xavier, and all the team at CSEP. It's always wonderful to participate in a CSEP event. Congratulations also to Professor Bajpai for this book. There's a reason I woke up very early to be at this event. What I thought I'd do is kind of draw out some of the crucial points that I thought that struck me from the book, and then pose some questions and perhaps some complications towards the end. I think, in some ways, books are very much a product of their times. And 15 to 18 years ago, you saw a slew of books with kind of the sense of optimism about the China-India relationship, what Kanti calls kind of the Chindia labeling, in particularly the mid-2000s. There were 2 aspects to this. One was kind of these comparisons of China and India, and you often saw this on the covers of The Economist with 2 tigers, for example. Or you saw it in the kind of Asia for Asian sort of China-India starting to cooperate, including in multilateral organizations, etc. And so you saw this kind of sense of optimism. Today, as all of you know, we're nowhere near that sense of optimism, and quite far away from it, in fact. And Kanti's book is really reflective of that sense of a China-India relationship, where differences are, at best, the book suggests, going to be managed rather than resolved or even set aside as they have been, as the theory of the case was that they could be for a number of years there. The book is really a timely, useful, and accessible assessment, which, among other things, points out of how much of a blip China-India phases have really been in the relationship, and how for much of their history since 1947 and 1949, respectively, the 2 countries have really kind of been, even if not at opposite ends, but had a series of divergences. And I think this is a particularly useful reminder for many outside India who think of Delhi's view of China as a challenge as a fairly recent phenomenon. In fact, some even just trace it back to Doklam. And I think, so while kind of, as Kanti outlines in the book, his book doesn't get into the kind of nitty-gritty of the developments in the relationship, of each one of the kind of dynamics, the bilateral, regional, and global differences that the 2 countries have, or where they have kind of the nitty-gritty of cooperation. But it does clearly delineate kind of this conceptual framing, as Ambassador Menon says, of kind of the 4 key drivers of conflict. And I think it also does a good job of showing how intertwined they are, how they interact with each other, in some ways how cumulative they can be, which it does pose a challenge. Let me say a few things about kind of each of the chapters which struck me, and I think that is worth spending some time on. I think the chapter on perceptions provides a good glimpse of kind of, in some ways, the 2 diametrically opposite views that in each side the publics have of each other. And this kind of, you could say this broadly ranges between dislike and disdain to kind of some amount of admiration, kind of as old civilizations, for example, or in India's case of seeing China achieve phenomenal economic growth. Though Kanti does point out that it is the negative views that do tend to prevail overall. I think the chapter also reminded me of something Susan Shirk wrote about, which is the asymmetry of perceptions. That China just looms larger in the Indian mindset than India does for China. And I think in some ways, this is kind of akin to, but opposite of, the India-Pakistan dynamic. The second driver that Kanti outlines is kind of the perimeter. which outlines the boundary dispute, the approach to it that both countries have taken militarily, but also importantly, Tibet, which I think Kanti very importantly points out is intimately connected to the boundary dispute for both sides, but particularly for Beijing. And I think the chapter helps answer a question that you often hear, particularly outside the two countries, and you've heard this over the last year and a half, is why do India and China care so much about these border areas? Why are they fighting over this barren land in the middle of nowhere at these great heights in cold temperature? I think the other chapter that I found quite striking was the chapter on partnerships, which I think makes three crucial and important points. One is that the China-India bilateral didn't exist and doesn't exist independently, but was shaped by the global environment and particularly the two countries' relationships with, but also with Moscow and Washington, but particularly kind of US-Russia, US-Soviet relations as well, which, as Kanti says, had a conditioning effect even on China-India relationship. The second, I think, important point that the chapter makes is that contrary to China and India's own triumphalist narratives, they didn't deal with their challenges, external or internal, via self-reliance, but actively pursued and used partnerships and what I like to call alignments with these kind of major powers. And I think the third important point the chapter makes is that in India's case, its alignments were driven from the beginning, and there have been multiple, as Kanti points out, by need to balance Chinese power. I think finally, kind of the chapter on power asymmetry is chock full of information, but I think it also makes a good point about taking a nuanced view of kind of numbers, with Kanti offering a caution about either side assuming an advantage, automatic advantage from certain factoids. So for instance, that the broader power gap, military power gaps, does not mean that China has an advantage on the border, or on the opposite side, assuming the fact that the PLA hasn't fought a war since 1979 would automatically translate into military ineffectiveness. Mm-hmm. Let me now kind of just note a few questions with regards to at least three of these four kind of chapters, partly because we know a lot more today than we did even 10 years ago about kind of some of these drivers. In addition to the kind of long list of books you'll find in the bibliography, I'd also suggest kind of supplementing this book with publications by Anant Krishnan, Sergei Radchenko, Zoravar Dolotsing, Oriana Mastro, Swapna Naidu, Lorenz Luthian, Arnie Westad have written books, Salman Khan on China's decision-making, for example, about the war, Harry Harding and Francine Frankel's excellent edited volume on the US-China-Indian triangle, not to mention Jabin and Antara's work as well. Based on a lot of these kind of contemporary readings that we have, I'd say on the perceptions, I think one of the things is the chapter captures popular and elite perceptions outside government, but it doesn't really cover policymakers' perceptions. And even though these aren't entirely disconnected, it's often the case that these are not the same. And I think that's been true in the past, and it's definitely true today. The conversation in government is not necessarily the same one that is reflected by the conversation outside. I think the second thing that is an interesting question is, Kanti notes that the lack of awareness that China and India often have of each other causes problems. But would more awareness really result in more positive views? As he raises in other parts of the book, as connectivity and communications have improved between the two sides, the relationship has actually become more strained. And I think this is important because it suggests, as many recommend improving knowledge of China, one should be realistic about what that can achieve and what the purpose is. It's not that it will resolve issues or the problems will disappear, but that it will give people a better understanding of a country that is India's main rival, and that is important in of itself. Let me just say on the power asymmetry, and we can have a longer discussion about the hard power, but I do want to mention the soft power debate that Kanti's book has really kind of struck up. And as Kanti argues, the gap between China and India is quite large, and he argues it's in favor of China. I think the argument is quite dependent on looking at the input side. That is what China is putting in, is trying to do. But if you look at the surveys and polls that focus on outputs, how many countries actually feel about China, you don't get the same view. The ICS poll, the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies poll, more Southeast Asians have confidence in India than China. Now you can say, okay, that's a small sample or it's a small difference. But if you look at who has no confidence in China versus India, that's even larger. And a number of in that poll show that these participants in the surveys think China has the greatest political and economic influence, yes, but large majorities have major concerns about the fact and major kind of difficulties with the fact that China has so much influence. And you see similar sentiments reflected in polls of Europeans, South Koreans, Japanese, Australians, that while China might be making these more efforts, it's not necessarily delivering in terms of results. In fact, perceptions of both China and Xi Jinping have actually hardened over time. I think the book also outlines soft power as the ability to influence countries to behave in a certain manner. But this is often, China's not often doing this through the power of attraction, but through the use of hard power, whether for persuasion or coercion. I want to make kind of two additional points, one on partnerships and one on, I'll end with a question kind of about a fifth P and whether Kanti should have added that separately. In terms of partnership, I think one question I have is, while I understand Kanti framing, looking at the US and the Soviet Union or Russia, I actually think it's quite important because this is not a quadrangular or a quadrilateral, it's really a pentagon, which is Pakistan. And China-Pakistan relations since the 60s and that deepening as really kind of affecting India's perceptions of China, as well as kind of the power asymmetries and a whole lot of other things, and adding to those divergences, I think, that India has. Second, I think in terms of partnerships, the historic dynamics, what we know thanks to the archives complicates the more traditional timeline of assessment the book offers. The book correctly notes, for example, the interconnection between how India's and China's relationships with the US shaped their relationship. I'd add to that how much India's perception of the Soviet Union and Sino-Soviet dynamics and India's overdependence on Moscow shaped its decision-making vis-a-vis Beijing and Washington. You see this, for instance, in terms of the 1980s, where Rajiv Gandhi's decision is partly for a rapprochement with China is partly affected by the fact, as Kanti outlines in the book, that Gorbachev had reached out for a rapprochement with China as well. Second, I think, the Indian ententes with China that Kanti talks about the book, I think Delhi's perspective is less targeted against the US in these ententes, as Kanti argues, more kind of issue-based alignment. And I mention this because we're talking about such issue-based alignment again. So this was not about against the US, but really on issues often related to sovereignty, for example. Finally, I think there's a much more complex historic picture of US relations with India and China. The book suggests that US-India cooperation with regard to China was essentially historically was a brief period between 1959 and 62. But we now know this was actually a longer period between 1956-57 and right through about 1969-1970. Strategic cooperation didn't fade away after 1962. It's in fact after 1962 that US and India signed an air defense agreement that essentially calls for mutual consultation in the event of a Chinese attack on India. There was US assistance during the 1965 war when the US warned China off against intervening in the India-Pakistan war. Intelligence cooperation between the two intelligence community, not just operational cooperation, but also U-2s taking off from India, the US helping India establish the Aviation Research Center, not to mention the Special Frontier Force that Kanti does talk about, along with a lot of economic aid, which with the explicit goal of not letting India fall to China. I'll end with a question about whether the book should have added that fifth P. And the one that I would put it broadly as is politics. Why do I say this? Because I think of how intertwined this subject has become with kind of decision-making and distinct from perception. Jabin might be able to talk about this better. It is his AOR. But the fact, for example, that even decision-making on something like a boundary dispute, why would Beijing, for instance, make what you could argue are tactical gains for a strategic loss in the case of some of their decision-making vis-a-vis the 2020 boundary crisis? Can we really explain that without thinking about where boundary issues and sovereignty issues feed into the Chinese leadership's idea of what they sell as, where they gain their legitimacy with their public, their sense of regime insecurity, and how that plays into their decision making on foreign policy making. You could argue a similar thing on the Indian side, but I think it's much more stark on the Chinese side vis-a-vis all the assertiveness that we've seen over the last couple of years. And sorry for taking a little more time, but the book really did, I think, elicit this kind of really deep reading that I at least went through. I have 7 pages of notes.
Thank you, Tanvi. Thank you very much. As you can see, Kanti, the book has not just served the general purpose that you mentioned. And thank you also, Tanvi, especially for mentioning internal politics, because I too feel very strongly that at pivotal moments in the India-China relationship, sort of 59, 62, 86, 89, and again 2017, 2020, it's the internal politics of both China and India which have been a major driver of where and some of the choices otherwise are inexplicable, quite frankly. But thank you for pointing to that. Kanti, I'll come back to you at the end after the discussants. The floor is yours now, Jabin.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. Let me also begin by thanking also CSEP for this invitation and congratulating Professor Bajpai for what I think is a magisterial synthesis. It's timed perfectly and its value will last a very long time. It's a volume that is both accessible and shorn of jargon, and for that itself, I think much thanks is due. And it's already quite the hit, going by the number of times it's been reviewed in the Indian press. Makes all our jobs that much harder in terms of coming up with something new to say, or even by way of criticism. But here goes anyway. I'm actually most fascinated by the chapter on perceptions, and because of a time limit, I'm going to try and stick to that and maybe relate other parts of the book to this particular section. The fact of the matter is that neither in India nor in China does what ordinary people what ordinary people think matter to the elites. China concluded and broke agreements with India irrespective of what its people thought about India, right? Irrespective of the positive or negative views Chinese might have had about India. India negotiated and continues to pursue negotiations with the Chinese, irrespective of what its own people say or think. So as fascinating as this chapter and as important as this chapter on perceptions is to our understanding, it's the deeper realities of the bilateral relationship that I'm equally fascinated by. It's just fascinating how adept the two governments are at usually ignoring and sometimes playing up, here China more than India, public opinion and perceptions as a factor that affects policy in their relationship. And here I like to think a little bit more about two expressions that Kanti used about racism and disdain that ordinary Chinese have. Now, this might be true up to a point, but I think we need to sort of relook these expressions. I mean, certainly with respect to the Uyghurs, with respect to Africans, and maybe to an extent with the Tibetans as well, we have what we call classical racism from the Chinese. But with respect to Indians and India, I mean, yes, there is behavior that we might consider offensive. And as a student in Taiwan, which also has a cynic culture, I faced a lot of this. But there's this beautiful example of Vikram Seth traveling through China, and people would never guess that he was Indian. The same thing happened to me several times, and it was an endlessly entertaining exercise to get people to guess where you're from. When all your life you've grown up thinking, as plain can be, that you are Indian. But there is, I think, a blank space in general perception of India among ordinary Chinese. Now, this is being increasingly filled with, I think, negative and vituperative opinion about Indians. And I would say this perhaps happens a little more since about 2015. But more than this, I think it's the perceptions of the elites that really matter. And I would say more than racism or disdain, these confrontations, these perceptions are actually political, precisely the result of a comprehension among Chinese elites that India is a pure civilization, currently decline or in decline, and a pure political power, potentially a competitor. So what you can describe as racism is a state-sponsored stuff, like that video we saw doing the rounds during Doklam, right? But I think we have to be very careful about giving the Chinese elite too much of a pass, by assuming that this is just ignorance or racism. I think you call this cognitive dissonance later in the book. What I would say is that Chinese elite engage in something one might call strategic racism or strategic disdain, or strategic in any case. You can blame it on the Chinese being racist and uninformed or whatever, rather than on the reality, which is that these are cold, hard, structural calculations that the Chinese take when dealing with India. For example, you say that the Chinese have symbolically denied India recognition as a great power by not talking about India's permanent membership on the UN Security Council. You give this example from this nuclear workshop that you attended in Shanghai in 1998, where the Chinese simply are blank when India and China are spoken of in the same breath. But we face this all the time at multiple BRI conferences. And I wouldn't say that Chinese put-downs of India are entirely innocent. There has never been a time, and especially not today, when Chinese scholars have not been alive to the political zeitgeist. They have not been alive to or conscious of the political imperative. They are not ignorant of realities. And India's distance in capabilities with China, the power asymmetry, the fourth P in your book, is not the only reality. China's inability to convert that gap into actual long-term results, as I think we might have seen in Ladakh last year, is also equally a reality, which somehow the Chinese are unable to deal with. And so, trying to overinterpret maybe some of these responses is perhaps doing ourselves a disservice. To say that, for example, as was said during Depsang, or even in the latest instances, that it's a local commander's initiative that sets off a particular incident at the LAC. I mean, how is this even possible for an army that functions as a political commissar? And I think this is all related to a key point that you make later in the book, which is that neither political leadership, at least since Nehru or Mao, have had the ability or the courage to handle nationalist domestic opinion. So, both countries, and especially in India, you prefer to make up for your shortcomings by interpreting the other's actions as mysterious, inscrutable, in the basest possible manner, and anything but as rational, cold, and calculating, with self-interest at core. To take off from Tanvi's point about the importance of internal politics, Ambassador Menon's point about internal politics, I think, the worldview section is particularly fascinating. And the juxtaposition in just a space of a few pages of traditional Indian and Chinese views is quite useful. But what I'd like to ask is, to question the contention that it is hard to imagine India as being a conqueror in relation to China. I mean, the BJP's notion of Akhand Bharat, for example, is already conceptually there. Tibet is a part of India's cultural space, not just for the BJP, but also for Nehru. And that is in itself enough for the Chinese to, be on edge. And I completely agree, actually, with the broad point about soft power. In fact, there was this comment made by Professor Surjit Mansingh many, many years ago about American perceptions of India and China. And she said that the Americans are so happy with whatever little they are able to achieve because they don't expect much from China. But with India, because the expectations are so high, the dominant perception is always disappointment at how little they have been able to achieve. And I think this speaks very much to the idea of soft power or the use of soft power or the difference in soft power between India and China. Finally, I'd like to highlight just one shortcoming, I think, and this, I think is a rather big one, which is that the works and views of scholars of India, scholars of China in India itself are almost completely missing from these pages. The work from the Institute of Chinese Studies, IDSA, ICW, even JNU, practically none of this is available. I think Anurag Vishwanath's current affiliation in India is ICS, and you do mention Giri Deshankar But one has to acknowledge that Indian scholars have gotten China right perhaps more often than the Americans have. I mean, the Americans wouldn't be in the sorry path with China right now if they had gotten China right, right? So it's probably not right, to say, for example, that there is no notable academic and policy expertise on the other country in India. Also not right, I think, to say that there is very little information about Indian perceptions towards China in the 18th and the 19th or the early 20th centuries. Tanvi gave us a list of modern writings, but I would like to give you a list of past writings from this period or examining this period. I mean, Madhavi Thampi's work on India and China, 1800 to 1949, or a work edited volume on India and China in the colonial world, or that excellent, lovely co-authored volume with Shalini Saxena of Mumbai University on China and the making of Bombay. I mean, this is all fantastic work, this beautiful, extremely perceptive biography or biographical account of the Indian soldier Gadadhar Singh, who was in the British employ against the Boxers in China. Cheen Mein Tera Mas, or 13 months in China. This has just been translated by Professor Kamal Sheel of BHU. So, I mean, there is plenty of work, and perhaps, as Tanvi suggested, maybe an annexure of these additional works can be added. Last point, I think, again, coming back to the internal point, I think at one point you make the claim that China is today a Republican power with a communist past. And I think that's, assuredly not the case. The president of China is the least important of Xi Jinping's titles. China is today in many ways much more Marxist, much more Stalinist than it has ever been. And I think understanding this fundamental reality will be crucial to understanding how we go about China policy making. These internal dynamics, I think Ambassador Menon also referred to it, and the book that by Amit Dasgupta and Lawrence Luthley that you refer to in your works, I think gives you a good example of how the internal dynamics in China affected the 1962 conflict. So yeah, let me conclude by one final point, which is I hope that Juggernaut, because it has a Hindi press, will also think of bringing out this book in Hindi, because this book certainly deserves to be read by a much wider audience than just the English-speaking audience in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jabin. Thank you for that really detailed response to the book. I'll leave it to Kanti to answer these points that you've made. But since you did mention a Hindi edition and we're talking to Juggernaut, I would say please put an index in future editions. It's just, yeah, I know it tempts people into the Delhi read, which is to look for their own name in the index, but that's not the point. It's also useful to scholars. Antara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. My compliments to Professor Bajpai for his new book, which could not have come at a more appropriate time, like other than this, taking forward and adding new momentum to the ever so engaging India versus China debate. Personally, I enjoyed reading the book and learned so much from it. My co-panelists, Dr. Tanvi Madan and Professor Jabin Jacob, have already done a wonderful job discussing and critiquing various important aspects of the book, leaving very little for me to add on. However, from my side, I would just like to make one small observation. I agree with Professor Bajpai's analysis that mutual perception plays a very important role in China-India relations, particularly Chinese public sentiment towards India. I would not say that it is simply negative about India. I would rather argue that it is a bit polarized, So on one hand, as Professor argues that India is often projected as an underdeveloped country with various problems like persistent poverty, caste and ethnic conflicts, various roadblocks to economic development and political chaos under the name of democracy. You can also see a more nationalistic analysis on India, which will project India not as a country, but as a geographical region, a British imperialist construct, whose disintegration and reshaping is communist China's historic mission. While on one hand, there is so much of negativity towards India, on the other hand, there is also widespread insecurity within Chinese society over the issue of India's rise, So will India surpass China in the future? Can Indian economy overtake Chinese economy in the long run? Can India supplement China in the global supply chain? Will India lobby with other world powers to displace or isolate China at the global bodies? Is it going to be a race between the hare and the tortoise? These are some of the questions that figure constantly in Chinese discussions on India. In fact, some Chinese analysts would even argue that though India's rise may not be as spectacular as China's, but still it is the best among all other developing countries. So they say that India rise story is somewhat subdued under the shadow of China, a little underappreciated by the international community. Meanwhile, I also see some genuine efforts being made by some individual scholars, strategists in China to understand India more objectively. In this regard, I would like to refer to a recent interview by Ambassador Yuan Nanxiang, former Consul General in Mumbai, and now with the Chinese think tank CICIR, where he brings attention to issues like how India, despite being economically inferior to China and having what they call a capitalist system, manages to have almost free healthcare, free education, free entertainment, and a robust reservation system. And various other pro-poor or pro-marginalized social policies, instead of indulging in a race for world-class cities or picture-perfect countryside, which has been the trend in China in the past several years. So I think in China, there is a whole range of opinions and views on India. Some, of course, are negative, some are positive, but the trend is certainly to have a more objective, more balanced understanding of India as China-India relation becomes more and more important, even in the Chinese strategic imagination. So I'll stop at that. And once again, compliments to Professor Bajpai for this wonderful book.
Thank you, Antara. Thank you very much for that. Kanti, I'll turn to you. When you write a book, at least in my experience, there's a moment when you get near the end or at the end, when you wonder who's ever going to read this book. And then suddenly you discover that people have read it and ask you all these impossible questions. I think you've seen how carefully your book has been read. So I leave it to you to respond to what the discussants have said.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks to all three for really perceptive probing comments. And they really got me thinking. Jokingly, I was thinking to myself that maybe I need to already rewrite the book in some respects. And that's a scary thought, as much for the reader as I suspect for me. But I think a lot of good points, but probably let me say one thing generally about the book. I mean, it had to be written very quickly. So that was the juggernaut mandate. And I didn't have much choice there. So I think, I do take the point that there's a lot of scholarship that you won't see featured in the bibliography. Actually, my publisher didn't want a bibliography at all, and as few notes as possible. But academics, we can't quite accept that sort of stricture. But on a more serious level, I think that's right, that there is an enormous amount of scholarship on partnerships, on perceptions, on the power. I think we probably got quite a bit more literature and measures, and I try to deal with some of the more prominent sets of facts and figures and so on. Yes, for sure. I think the book had to be very tight. It was supposed to be a 50,000 word book. It's about 75, 80,000. But even that was not quite what Juggernaut wanted. It's not quite the book they ever imagined, I think. So I take the general point about, better coverage of the literature, but it really wasn't feasible, I think. And not being quite a China specialist, I think I might have just drowned in all that scholarship and detail. And what I set out to do was write an imperfect book, but one that would, elicit the kinds of questions and even objections, and really make, and to some extent just to provoke people to think. So it's not a book, I think, that really, wanted to be a definitive work. I mean, Tanvi's massive book is that kind of book, but this was more a provocation and a sort of a quick attempt to intervene, and at a time when there was a lot of interest in the issue. So let me just say that about the kind of lacuna in the book that in relation to a very fine work in India and outside of India as well. I think I'll pick up on 2-3 points that some of which cut across the points of view. I mean, I think everyone's made the point that the book seems to be a bit light on the issue of politics, particularly the domestic politics that seem to affect all of these things. Well, politics, Jabin says, affects even the issue of perceptions, because these perceptions don't just bubble up naturally from below somewhere or through Chinese and Indian society, particularly in China. Perceptions are molded and used and for political purposes. So they're very strategic that way. I think Tanvi also raised the point about politics, internal politics, and how it's affected decisions. And perhaps Chinese politics has pushed it towards a kind of a more tactical view of dealing with India. And as a result, the Chinese have lost the strategic, bigger strategic picture and possibility with India. And I think even Antara makes the point that there are different views within China on India. And when one view prevails, either in decision making or even more publicly, there's something probably political going on there. That some schools of thought or views are squashed or subdued, and others are allowed to flourish and affect policymaking. So I think I take that point, and that could have been the fifth P, but I think probably it's a P that runs through all the other Ps. I do think that overall domestic politics is important in both countries. And I mean, if you think about the issue of Tibet, obviously, right from the start, I mean, that's an enormous domestic political issue which impacts on the border problem, but it is an enormous internal issue, and it continues to be. I mean, I think there's a question later in the chat function about Tibet and the Dalai Lama, and I mean, clearly, Chinese worries about the integration of Tibet remains very, very important, and I think my instinct is, I mean, I'm not enough of a specialist to say, but I think my instinct is that a lot is driven by Tibet. Not everything, but a lot is driven by continuing fear that India, along with other powers, could play a role that would be very uncomfortable, particularly as we go into this transition, as it were, with the Dalai Lama getting older. I hope he lives a long time, but a time will come. And I think that moment will have to be handled very carefully in both countries. But it does raise the issue of how China has seemingly perhaps not got its politics right with respect to Tibet, and therefore the relationship with India is always a difficult one. I think the other point about the politics playing into the relationship is that, I mean, there is a kind of, I agree with that. And I think here and there in the book, but perhaps not underlined as much as the three of you have made the point on, that, there is a kind of unease in China about India. I think it was all of you pretty much said that there is a sneaking kind of feeling that India may be this Luan nation, chaotic and all of that. But were it to get its act together, it would be a real competitor. I mean, we know that in population terms, for instance, that India may open up a gap of 300 to 400 million people on China in 20, 30 years from now. And a story I tell at the beginning of the book about, this conference I was in where some poor Indian student said something to the effect that, well, India will pass China in terms of population. And there was a Chinese lady, a very nice woman, but she was shocked and immediately interrupted to say that that was impossible, that China could not be behind India on anything. And in that same conference, I have a story about a very nice Chinese professor, very sober, measured man sitting next to me. And when there was a comparison of nuclear weapons with, the Chinese being compared to the French or the British, and then somebody had the temerity to mention the Indian nuclear weapons program. And this professor was genuinely, sincerely, he couldn't fathom how India could be talked about in the same breath as China on nuclear issues. So I repeat these stories only to show that, to underline what you've said, which is there is a politics here. There's a kind of cultural politics of unease that India might actually catch up someday. While at the same time, there's this kind of disdain, India is so chaotic, it never will. But I think there's this fear that at a moment, it might get its act together, and then the issue will be joined between these two great civilizations. So I take the point that probably isn't centered enough or made enough of it in the book, but I agree with that point. I think on the larger issue that Tanvi raised, I think about the American partnership, that I kind of slough it off a bit and say there was only that 2-3 years from 59 to 62 that they were partners. But of course, I think you're absolutely right that from quite early, there was the idea that India would be a kind of balancer to China, and that the United States had to invest in it. And I just replay, of course, the kind of stuff that Kennedy and others were saying about we have to make sure that India wins the competition with China. Actually, some of the stuff that Tanvi just pointed out, I didn't know that well. So thank you for that on many lines of partnership that continued. Of course, the biggest element of that was, the kind of development aid, I suppose, that the United States, through multilateral or bilateral means, gave to India. And there was always a strategic purpose there. So I think the book probably does underplay that. But again, questions of space and focus probably made me underplay that part of it. I think we know much more about the depth and scope of the partnership now than we did then. And I think surely your book, which I'm sorry, I just didn't get enough of a chance to read at that time. It was on my list, but juggernauted me into meeting deadlines. But I'm sure there's a fabulous story that you tell about India-US cooperation in those times much more deeply. Perhaps I'll just stop there. So there must be other questions, and
thank you.
And I'm sure, I'll come back on things.
Thanks a lot. I think since we're running out of time, maybe I'll start channeling audience questions to you. There's one maybe this should be answered by Tanvi. How much is the American influence responsible for the current India-China, as you call it, rivalry?
Okay.
This is the flip side of what Kanti was just saying, actually.
I'm happy to cede this to Tanvi.
So, I think to one extent, and Kanti makes this point about kind of, as I said, about conditioning effect, and I might be paraphrasing this, but it's a good line in Kanti's partnership chapter, which is these alignments that China and India have had are both cause and effect. But I will say, and you'll often see this, particularly a point that Beijing tries to say that, look, this is all, and I've heard these in a number of China-India discussions when Americans aren't in the room. We don't really have any problems. It's either the US causing them, or if you just stop your relationship with the US, it'll all be fine. But if you think about it, and I think the book makes this point quite well, which is that the fundamental issues aren't about the US and Soviet Union. At least for India, these are about differences with China. The boundary dispute wasn't caused by the US. It wasn't even kind of in the picture. And now if you look at it, and again, Kanti makes this point in the book, you can solve the boundary dispute tomorrow. The competition is not going away because you have this series of bilateral differences, whether it's kind of, the sharing of the Brahmaputra waters, whether it is economic differences and frictions, technology differences, whether it's, and the use of economic influence and other kinds of influence, or it's regional difference, not just the China-Pakistan relationship, but China's, the overlapping periphery problem with China's increasing influence in India's neighborhood. And I think this fundamental broader point, which you could say has a little more to do with kind of China's view of the US, but this idea of China keeping India, hindering at best and harming at worst India's global ambitions and interests through both the partnership with Pakistan, but also with its behavior in kind of international organizations. And I think this does bring the point that yes, there are, and you could argue that this might be the case in China's decision making last year. We just don't know enough about the reasoning, or I don't, which is that China is seeing India through a competition with US prism, and that is shaping its decisions. Is the US actively kind of, causing these problems? I think it suits the US that India and China have divergences, but it's a Goldilocks view. It is not in US interest for India and China to go to war for various reasons, including it'll call upon them to make certain choices. Now they made a choice last year, but I do think, these are problems that are about China and India. And yes, there are these conditioning effects. And I think within the space of competition, I will say, just add one point about where there's a US dimension, but again, it's about China, India. It's this point about ideology. For all the kind of dismissiveness of India and disdain and disorganized, chaotic country, China clearly sees India as a challenge. Otherwise, why spend so much time on kind of trying to stop it from going towards the US or challenging the fact? Now, you could argue that one aspect of this, as Ambassador Menon, Shamsara, and Vijay Gokhale pointed out, that if India succeeds as a democracy, that fundamentally is an ideological challenge to China, right? Or you can say, make the more geopolitical point, including in relation to the Quad. But there's also the point, if this is such a disorganized, chaotic country, how has it managed to hold China at the border and inflict casualties? How do you sell that to a public after you've told them that this is a country that really doesn't matter and is not that challenging? So I think these are fundamentally problems that, yes, are very much conditioned by these partnerships, but they are about China and India. And I think Beijing actually makes a mistake sometimes by seeing it through a US prism, either deliberately, or maybe they fundamentally believe that, but I think they're mistaken in that belief.
Thank you, Tanvi. Thank you very much. Which leads us logically to the next question, which I think is primarily for Kanti, but for anybody else who would like to chip in as well. Will the 4Ps preclude any future cooperation or an amelioration of the relationship between India and China? And if they do manage that, what are the potential areas of cooperation between them? I think the book is fairly pessimistic about it, but Kanti, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think the book is pessimistic. I mean, for a very long time, when I did write on India-China issues, I was more optimistic. I mean, just a few years ago, I edited a book where I talked about, a kind of cold peace, which is the title of a nice book as well. But I think writing this book, I became more pessimistic, and it just seems, as someone said on the panel, very structural, the problem, and and that carries over into the strategic partnerships issue. India being weaker needs a balancer against China, and the Chinese play a different game. They don't really need to balance against Indian. They don't need a partner to balance against Indian power, and so it's a funny relationship. And by saying that, I don't mean that it's India that's driving the problem in the quadrilateral of powers, because it's constant search for alignment. But it does mean that it's a very difficult set of relationships. And at this juncture, and happy to hand over to the rest of the panelists, I mean, you have a situation where the Chinese and the Americans, I think, are in Cold War. The Russians have more or less thrown in their lot with the Chinese, though not altogether. India has been shoved increasingly, probably further than it wanted to go, towards the Americans. It's very hard to see how that would change in the near future, given the disparities of power between India and China and these four issues that divide them. The only other thing to say is that, yeah, there is cooperation, I know, in regional and multilateral settings on things like, from time to time, climate change, or on issues of sovereignty that Tanvi pointed out, where both countries take a hard view of sovereignty and are allergic to things like R2P and humanitarian intervention and so on. I think the fear of protectionism in certain countries in the Western world is a common worry, and how the West sometimes uses institutions for its own good and is not truly multilateral. I mean, those are areas where they converge, but I don't think, they don't spill over into the bilateral positively. And that's the problem, I think, so I see, the Quad being quite difficult to change and to see, a cooperation emerging between India and China, partly as a result of the Quad itself.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Yes, Jabin.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, I think I'll agree with the pessimistic outlook, but I also want to sort of underline that, even in the past 70 years, both China and India have seen such massive upheavals, which have led to rapid policy turnarounds. And I think, just to take the case of India-China relations, I mean, if you look at 1988, the Rajiv Gandhi visit, we came out of nowhere in a manner of speaking. I mean, you establish one beachhead, then you have the 2005, I'm not saying that there wasn't preparation for it, but I'm saying that for the rest of the world looking, it came out of, literally nowhere. Then in also 2005, agreement on political parameters and guiding principles. I mean, I think from the moment we signed it, we knew that this wasn't really going to be followed. But it is like the Lilliputians pinning Gulliver down. All right. I mean, these things matter. And I think perhaps it looks sort of difficult right now, but there will be opportunities. And frankly, the interesting part is that it is India that has the capacity to make use of those opportunities when they come. For all our weakness, for all the gap in capacities or power, it is India with the, as a weaker power perhaps, that will be able to do it. I mean, fundamentally, the problem is, I think, to take on from what Tanvi was saying, the Chinese are in a very weird situation where they cannot be seen as showing India agency. It has to always be a China-US conflict, because otherwise their entire narrative at home would collapse. And that makes it interesting and full of possibilities for us. Of course, the Americans, possibilities for Americans as well. So, yeah, I mean, I'd say interesting times, not in the Chinese sense, of course. Yeah.
Thank you. I can't resist saying that, if the Chinese had such disdain for India, they wouldn't need to put so much effort into their relationship with Pakistan, transferring nuclear weapons, doing all kinds of things. They wouldn't have to do what they did in 2020 in Ladakh. I mean, there's a whole, actually, so it seems to me the more they try and convey disdain, and the more seriously they actually take us. So I watch their actions, not what they say, for a real insight into how policymakers perceive India. I think perceptions are very important, but in the Chinese case, it's the perceptions of a very small circle of people. The problem, of course, with the future is that, frankly, we all extrapolate from what we have. And we know the future is never a direct straight line extrapolation. When our whole experience shows us how, as once said, history proceeds in a screwy manner, meaning in a spiral type. But it does, there are discontinuities and change. I have a question from Ambassador Mehrotra saying trust lies at the core of any friendship. While there's no trust between India and China, how can there be any friendship there? Chinese have violated every agreement and every understanding with them since 1950 to date, including on de-escalation in Ladakh recently. Who wants to take that on?
Yeah, I think, I'll just say a couple of words, but it'd be nice to hear from Antara as well and on this perhaps. It becomes a bit tautological in the argument. I say it in the book that China and India didn't cooperate, say, on the border better or in other spheres because they don't trust each other. But of course, you could reverse it and say, because they don't trust each other, they don't cooperate. So the argument tends to be a bit circular. But I mean, tautological arguments can be interesting because they force you to ask, well, why don't they trust each other? I mean, in this case. And I think there again, we come back to some cultural, social, political issues, and also geopolitical issues. I mean, I said that in the book that they don't trust each other partly because they were never allies. I mean, they were briefly during World War II, if you like, because they fought on the same side, but never thereafter. But in a sense, historically, they don't have a very rich, I would say, long historical diplomatic history. I mean, there's Buddhism and the pilgrimages, and there's trade, and there was some people movement, and they knew each other in third regions. But the great centers of power, the Indian empires historically and the Chinese, not sure that they had an enormous amount of diplomatic traffic. So there isn't, again, that kind of rich diplomatic history which they can draw on to understand each other better and build trust. I think also that matters of political style in the perimeters chapter, you can see how Nehru, as the kind of a liberal politician, and I mean liberal in a political sense, his legal background, I mean, he looked at borders and these kinds of issues as quite a forensic way. And he took a very conservative view of the borders. I mean, you looked at treaties and customary sort of understandings going back. But Mao and Zhou Enlai, I mean, they were revolutionaries. They took very strategic views of these kinds of questions. And so, there's the kind of inability at a political cultural level to kind of comprehend each other. And if you can't, then you can't decipher what the other is doing. I mean, for communists, all the stuff of liberal institutions and so on are Maya, they're illusion, that the bourgeoisie uses to get its way and to stay in power. So the more Nehru and India talk about legalities, I mean, for communists, this is like, you're just trying to pull the wool over our eyes. And I think on the Indian side, this very strategic perspective, sometimes the Chinese could be very hard-nosed, other times they seem to be much softer, because they're playing a strategic game or a tactical game sometimes. And, for the Indian side, they were looking for consistency, and you proceed with the facts and the historical facts and the legal facts and so on. So again, it's hard to build up trust when you're playing, your vocabularies are so different.
बंद क्यों करोगे?
Stop.
तो ये बंद क्यों करोगे?
I think please turn off your mics, everyone else. Kanti, I've lost you.
Yeah, so I just wanted to end on that point, that there's a combination of, I think, of culture, political culture, different leadership styles and values, and of course the absence of, kind of a long diplomatic history of contact between the great centers of their political authority. And so, I think one can build an argument about why there isn't trust without getting tautological about it.
Quite right. I think because we never entered into each other's political and security calculus. And when we did, we didn't have agency, or not very much.
Yeah.
So, yeah. There's a question here, maybe for Antara. Can China's behavior be explained by its misperceptions about itself as the new global hegemon? By this version of history that she tells herself of China's global primacy, etc., which I don't think everybody else accepts this version. But in fact, the book summarizes Zhang Weiwei's summary of this triumphalist China.
Sure.
Can that explain China's behavior, Antara?
Thank you, sir. I would like to address this question together with another important question that comes up many times in the course of the book, that is, why should China concede anything to India? Since it is a much bigger power, it has a massive lead on India on all accounts. I understand that power differential is a very important aspect defining China-India relations. And presently, the issue dominates any and every discussion on China and India, both within India and outside India. And I can also see the issue being played up very big by the Chinese propaganda outlets like Global Times, where probably every article on India would end up with a sentence saying, oh, Chinese economy is 5 times that of India's, and India dare not confront China, or China doesn't even consider India as a worthy enemy, and so on and so forth, similar kind of assertions. But interestingly, when I look at China's internal debates and discussions on India, I find the power asymmetry narrative to be strangely missing. When I look at, say, Chinese journal articles or publications by Chinese think tanks, interviews, commentaries by Chinese scholars or India experts, I realized that the focus within China is much less on the power differential and much more on the value that a good China-India relation can deliver to China and how best China can solicit that cooperation from India. And cooperation with India is not a passing trend in China. It is a strategic goal mandated at the highest level by their National Congress. Of course, there are differences in opinion in how to go about this cooperation with China. So some would argue that China needs to induce India into cooperation by preferably offering non-core economic incentives, while others would say that China should use its strength advantage against India to force it to cooperate, like it did in the Galwan clash. But regardless of the differences in methods, there is little doubt in China about the significance or the value of India-China relationship to China and China's global diplomacy. So what cooperation does China seek from India, and what value can a good China-India relationship provide to China or China's global strategy? First of all, China requires India's help to cope up with the US free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, or at least to make it less harmful to Chinese interests. And why particularly India? Because India is one country which is not a US ally. So it has a room to maneuver. If India joins actively, then Indo-Pacific becomes a reality. And if it doesn't, then, again, it takes a back seat. So that's why there is huge interest within China to reach out to India on Indo-Pacific issue. Secondly, although it is strategically underplayed, India remains at the heart of, or at the core of, China's two-ocean strategy, which is meant to open up a dedicated Indian Ocean exit for China under the Belt and Road Initiative to overcome the Malacca dilemma and also what they call the US strategic chain, island chain strategy in the South and East China Sea. On the economic front, Chinese are really concerned that if geoeconomics fail between China and India, it will only be geopolitics governing China-India relations, leaving very little room to China for any kind of maneuver, And finally, we should also not discount how good relations with India benefits China in having peace and stability in its western frontier and allows Beijing to keep its entire focus on and the best resources for its intensifying rivalry with the United States and its allies. So coming back to the question that comes up many times in the book, that why should China concede anything to India? I think if we look at China-India relations only through the prism of power differential, then of course China has no need to concede anything to India, and India has no option but to tolerate an assertive and insensitive China. But when we consider the importance of this relationship to China and India's growing role as what they say, a major determinant of Chinese foreign policy, then we can have a very different picture altogether, a very different equation between these two countries. So yeah, that's what I wanted to just flag. Thank you.
Thank you, Antara. Thank you very much. Two last quick questions. Somebody has asked, Anmol Yadav, China is still India's largest trading partner, despite the numbers going down slightly. Where do you see this economic relationship going? And China became our #1 trading partner last year, despite what happened on the border. Where does this go? Where does it lead us?
Yeah.
Maybe Jabin and Kanti.
Jabin, go ahead.
Okay, look, I don't see why the two cannot coexist. I mean, there are two tracks essentially. We cannot walk out of or decouple entirely from an economic partnership with the Chinese, but there are things that we need to do where national security and perhaps competitive advantages of cutting edge frontier technologies or industries meet. There, I think we are already doing the right things by keeping Chinese 5G out, banning Chinese apps, and so on. So I think this will continue. It's not as if the Chinese are going to be able to decouple from the US, even though they want to, right? Now, it's like I said before, I think it's up to us to be able to leverage those opportunities that we have, and look at it with perhaps a more positive manner. I mean, where would we have gotten our API if not from China? Yeah.
Want to add anything?
I agree with that. So I don't have much to add. I think that
one last quick round then. How much of this will change if Xi Jinping goes? Kanti?
Well,
politics question in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that if he isn't replaced by someone who has the kind of control and so on that he has, that the situation might be worse with China, that you may have all kinds of different groups and factions and agencies that cannot be brought together to pursue a certain line of policy, including cooperation with India. And we may see a lot of noise in the system and a greater uncertainty. I think that's, if Xi Jinping has become the kind of, the most powerful leader since Mao, I mean, we may very well see a decision to pull back from that after him and to have more collective leadership and so on. So whether collective leadership is, if it becomes a noisy system and they're not able to exert control enough, then that may not be good for the India-China relationship. And on the other hand, a very powerful Xi Jinping has, I think, clearly not been an easy customer to deal with either. So to me, if it moves towards a more collective leadership, that's a good one, then that might be the perfect for India. You don't have an overbearing Xi Jinping. On the other extreme, you don't have a collective leadership that just can't exert any control and deliver on anything. But a good business-like, well-organized collective leadership, if it transits to that, then I think that would be good for India. But I'm not enough of a China specialist to say much beyond that. But one last thing I'll say is, which I guess is in India-China relationships now, I always look to Tibet. And if you want to say anything about where it's going to go, please look at what's happening in Tibet, and China's dealing with it.
Thank you. I'll come back to you, Kanti, for a final word, but let me just go through. Tanvi, if you want to answer this question or say something at the end.
Well, I want to answer this one. I suspect Jabin and Antara will have more incisive things to say, but I will say, this point about can China and India be friends or cooperate? I think we should be realistic about whatever engagement down the line, which is Indian policymakers, when they have had this idea of kind of friendship as the objective, they've gone wrong. We're not going to be friends. It's about being neighbors. And I think this is something Manohar Parker, I remember, had this analogy about how you deal with neighbors. And that is something I think to keep in mind, which then feeds into this point about trust that was asked earlier. I think it's not just an abstract concept. We do see it if, for example, you're even thinking about signing confidence building measures, agreements, and you cannot trust that the other side is going to stick to them, as has been the case this last year and a half, then that means something very different. Or if, and some of this is deliberate, you can say that China has actively gone against them. Others are its interests change as its capabilities change, not sending troops abroad, saying that they probably meant it when they said it. This changes over time. But I think what it means for India is being realistic about what the objective of cooperation or engagement with China is, which is it's not friendship, it is coexistence with a neighbor, and taking advantage of the relationship for India's own interests. And second, when you are thinking about creating these measures, it should proceed from the assumption, and they should be designed around the fact that there isn't trust And so emphasize the verification part, whether that's at the border or in other domains, and make sure you have a backup plan.
Thank you, Tanvi. Jabin, you
Yeah,
want to answer the question or not? Up to you, but any final words?
Yeah, I think overall, I'd say that, in the India-China relationship, it doesn't really matter so much the leadership. I mean, it's not as if the boundary dispute is about to be resolved, even with the collective leadership of a good sort that Kanti mentions. But I would like to say that things are never as good as they appear to be. I mean, especially in the last few years, I think that's one of the lessons that when we pander to egos and individuals and undermine institutions on our side, I think that's always bad news for the India-China relationship. I think that's a point that needs to be underlined. Second, I see opportunity. I mean, in every crisis with China, I think we've actually managed to come up better because simply we have been able to face up to that crisis. My fear today is that we are trying to run away from facing up to the crisis. And I think that is, again, a big challenge, not just for us academics, but also for policymakers, for the bureaucracy, for the military in general. So, I'm not so much concerned about what's going on in China itself. I'm concerned about our responses, our institutions, our fundamentals when we think and look at China. And I think that needs to be underlined ad nauseum, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the book actually ends with the right question, actually. How desperately do Indians want to be powerful? I think a lot of it is that. Antara, last word before I go back to Kanti.
Yes. As a concluding remark, I would like to say that China-India relations follow a pattern, marked by alternate episodes of camaraderie, conflict, hope, and despair. So I think this trend is going to continue as long as I can see. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Antara. Kanti, you brought us here. Thank you for giving us this wonderful book and this wonderful excuse to have a really good discussion. I thought we covered a lot of ground, showed some confusion, but that's natural. That only shows that we're being honest. But thank you for this. What would you like to say right at the end?
Well, just, thank, of course, CSEP for this opportunity, and fellow panelists to get fantastic feedback and for taking the discussion much further, actually, than the book does. I think just on the book, as a final word, I would just say that something that was mentioned, and just to echo it, which is that I think if there was a deeper objective of the book, it is that we in India, we have to look this relationship very coldly in the eye. We can't run away from, these 4 Ps, one could add another couple of Ps, but so the aim of the book was a little bit to hit people between the eye and force us to think. I don't think the book gets everything right, but if it does force us to think, look at this relationship very coldly and clearly, then I think it will have done something.
Thank you, Kanti. Thank you very much. And it only remains for me to thank all the panelists for not only what you've said, but for actually adding to certainly my knowledge here. I'll hand this over back to Constantino Xavier for the last word.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. Kanti, I think you've hit us between the eyes really hard, all of us. So thank you for bringing out this book. You have a wide following among generations of scholars on Indian foreign policy, India-China, India-Asia relations. So thank you for bringing this book to CSEP. And I could just reinforce, I think, the point made about a possible Hindi translation. And may I extend the burden on translators. I'd also like to see Ambassador Menon's and Dr. Madan's book in Hindi, and all 3 of your books in Mandarin. I think that would be also an interesting challenge I put out there. Thank you, Tanvi, Jabin, Antara. Wonderful to have you. You've always been great colleagues and friends of CSEP, and hopefully we can continue collaborating on more of this research, some of the work at CSEP that we're doing under Ambassador Menon's guidance on China, South Asia in particular, project that we've benefited from your inputs. And last but not least, Ambassador Menon, thank you so much for guiding us here today, leading this discussion, moderating it. I can think of no one better to have done this. In fact, so good that I may have lost my job as a moderator at CSEP, and we hope to have you again in the chair for future sessions. But in particular, for your encouragement also for the work we do at CSEP on China, on the neighborhood. I think the times are changing for the better in India, and we're getting a wonderful, I think, combination of different scholars, practitioners, former practitioners, in your case, Ambassador Menon, that have really pushed us to do better, more historically, analytically, and critically with the freedom of the mind, I think, to re-engage with many of these usually quite charged ideologically questions, but I think we're all looking at them more objectively. So thank you all, and do join us again for future events at CSEP, and stay well, stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you all.